Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining me for this week's edition, the Valentine's edition of the SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. It's Wednesday, February 14th, 2024, and today we're going to be answering 3 questions we've been hearing from international educators over the last few days. Before we get into those questions, we want to give a special shout out to those of you who've been listening loyally on our podcast version of the Midweek Roundup with well over 3,100 downloads now for the last few years that we've been doing this. Really a pleasure to be coming to into your ears, into your brains every week to talk about these international education issues. And to those who are watching live or on repeat on our YouTube, LinkedIn, Twitter, or Facebook pages, we appreciate you listening in each week to get our thoughts on the topics of the day in our field. So, as we do each week, we take the stories that we cover here in question format on the Roundup from our newsletter that comes out on Mondays each week. And for those who aren't subscribed to the newsletter, that's available on our website at smieconsulting.org/subscribe. And I'll be dropping the link to that in the chat here in a minute. And that will help you, if you want, scroll down to the subscribe button, and then you can enter your name, institution, and your email address, and we'll get you signed up for that newsletter right away. We also have a LinkedIn version of that newsletter that you can subscribe to for free, and that is available. That comes out every week at 8:30 a.m. Eastern Time every week on LinkedIn. So I'm going to be putting the LinkedIn version of this week's newsletter where you can subscribe directly from that newsletter template that you see in the chat. And they also will drop in the email version so you can stay up to date with what's going on as we chat through these 3 questions today. Now, the newsletter covers social media and international education news every week. Covers about 20, 30 different topics every week, from AI, social media, digital news, webinars that are coming up, blogs that are of particular relevance, I think, and then also covers international ed news, both in the U.S. in terms of top news stories affecting international educators in the U.S. and students, and then also solutions on how we can potentially overcome some of the challenges we face in our business, and there are a few, aren't there? And finally, we also have a global roundup as part of that newsletter that talks about, like we do each week here on the Roundup, talks about different countries around the world and the challenges that they are facing with restrictions and or growth in international student mobility to their countries and to and from their countries. So let's get right to the first question of the day. How are you messaging Asian students today? Now, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to know that when we talk about messaging in Asia, everybody's eyes first usually go to China, and for good reason, since they have been until recently the number one source of international students in the United States. But what's important, I think, to keep in mind when we're talking about Asia is it is a very diverse region, from the Middle East through to East Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, very different than very distinct regions. That's an easy way to say it. But in terms of what we can do to better break down Asia into manageable chunks, anyone who's traveled there knows that it's a very challenging region at times to come up with a consistent approach that will work well in every country. And one of the reasons it doesn't, we know in China that it's a completely different social ecosystem there. You have to be on their individual platforms, WeChat, Youku, Douyin, all the different versions that they have, QQ, of our Western social media. So that is a challenge in and of itself. But it's also within Korea, knowing that Naver is where students are spending their time, and which messaging platforms in India versus Vietnam versus Thailand are most effective, or is it TikTok, like in Indonesia, which is one of the top 3 countries in the world that's on TikTok. And kind of wrapping your heads around all that data and what works in different countries is a messy one. It's not easy. and traveling in the region is never a cakewalk either. So there are always going to be challenges here when we think about these things. And today, what I'd like to do is share with you a little bit on what some of our friends in the business that are active in Asia have had to say. First up is a webinar coming up a week from tomorrow on Thursday the 22nd from our friends at Synorbis on tools and strategies to engage students from Asia. Now, they talk about whether it's Line in Japan and Thailand, WhatsApp in India, WeChat in China for messaging. They have a platform now that can go pan-Asia in terms of being able to use similar messages and send out across those different social platforms to students in country. So it allows that flexibility in terms of how you respond to students. There is also a trend report here from our friends at Sunrise. Talks about various trends in Chinese education that have to do with agents that have developed in the region over the last 3 or 4 years, particularly since COVID. There was a big contraction in the number of agents pre-COVID, and during COVID certainly didn't help. And now there's a growth again, but from unlikely sources and smaller mom and pop shops that might not have the funding to go through accreditation. So there's all sorts of interesting twists and turns in this in looking at Asia. So what when we talk about that, and particularly our friends at Synorbis and Sunrise, they both know China very well. That's where Sunrise started and has made their bread and butter there. Synorbis started in China and has expanded into a Pan-Asia approach to messaging, digital platforms, and all of that. But one of the other pieces of this puzzle, and that is also worth noting here, is what's happening with agents in China, and that's a particular concern. Particularly if you've not been active in China yet, you certainly will want to be, because there's a lot going on, and it's not a market that's dying. It's maybe going through some changes in terms of where students are going, but there's still huge demand for study abroad in China. But it's a lot more competitive landscape, so that means having a very specific approach to not just focusing on if you're not a top tier institution, not just focusing on the major metropolitan areas and getting out to the second and third tier cities in the country where there may be more willingness to go outside of those top institutions that traditionally top Chinese students fled to. So the key is in China, in India, in Thailand, in Vietnam, in Japan, Korea, it's knowing what platforms the students are on that's half the battle. And this is something we always talk about at SMIE Consulting. And I do this in my role with UNLV as Director of Global Recruitment and Partnerships, is making sure we have an understanding across our campus in terms of, on the prospective student side, living where your audiences live and having a presence. And that means these days in the digital age, having a presence on those platforms where those students spend their time. And the folks at Synorbis have that dialed in. They have the data to back up why you're focusing online in Japan and Thailand, why it's Naver in Korea, why it's WhatsApp in India and other countries that you know that. So you have an advantage going in, that you're prepared for making the right decisions in the right countries. So key in all of these is not only living where your audience lives, but also have messaging that is attractive for students in that audience, in that demographic, in that country. And more students expect to be able to communicate with current students as part of their journey. So are current students involved in your current messaging out to students, to future students? If they're not, maybe that's something that in your key markets you work on developing, the kind of student ambassador roles or volunteers that you can train on standard admissions questions, but really to talk about student life, to be able to have those folks that can provide that outlet for the need future students have to know what's going on your campus if they're going to make a truly informed decision, because we all know they're not going to visit before they come. So the more opportunities you have to put your current students in front of your future students, and if you can do that from the same country or same language group, then you're increasing the opportunities for you to enroll that student, as long as, of conversations are positive. So these are the challenges we face in messaging to students in Asia, and certainly those of us that have traveled in the region know it's different everywhere you go. There isn't a one size fits all for messaging out anymore, and if not all campuses are even segmenting out for special international campus messages, international student messages. And that's something that really should be a priority for your institution if you're going to be taken seriously by students, is having messaging that reflects the needs that you have, that your future students have. And the more you can attune your messaging with those needs, the better your opportunity is to convert them through the process. Let's get on to our second question of the day. And this is one that, for those that have watched us on the Roundup for any length of time, you know that when it comes to the issue of testing, particularly standardized testing on the academic achievement side, at the undergrad level especially, this is one of those not pet projects, but certainly one of those issues that can really get you going. And there aren't too many on the side of, oh, we need to go back to standardized testing. And where we've seen that happen, typically it's been either because they're elite institutions and they don't want to change, they don't think they have to change. If they've changed, it's because the peer pressure on them to do so was significant enough that we saw all during the pandemic that now 75% of U.S. colleges and universities have gone test optional for undergraduate admissions. We've seen an increase in the number of graduate programs going test optional, though some programs are restricted in terms of being able to do that by accrediting body for graduate MBA programs, for example. You need to have a GMAT or a GRE for them to admit you in almost all cases. For undergraduates, it could be if you're at an elite school, MIT, I think they went test optional for one term, but they went quickly back to requiring international all students to take SAT or ACT. So we have seen, the question is test optional dying with elite colleges? We already shared that 75% of all U.S. undergraduate institutions are test optional now. So that's the real positive news, I think, in terms of where the movement has been going. And when we talk about elite colleges, we are talking about such a small microcosm of U.S. higher education, but they receive obviously an outsized portion of attention from news outlets whenever they make big decisions, or what we would consider minor, but when they make decisions to remove tests or reinstate tests, then it usually gets a lot of likes and a lot of links and a lot of eyes on. In this one particular case, Dartmouth is the first of the Ivies to have broken from the test optional bandwagon that they all rallied onto during the pandemic, with good reason. They'd be foolish to have not gone test optional during the pandemic. But you could tell that there were some of them that were just getting a little bit antsy. It's like, oh, are we really crafting our classes the way we want them to last fall and in 2022? Do we really get the data to show that we don't need these test scores anymore and we're still getting high achievers in the classroom? These are all the kinds of questions that go on at only a very small percentage of colleges in the United States. But again, they receive the largest share of news attention. So Dartmouth has made the decision to go back for fall 24, or fall 25 maybe. Fall 25, I guess, would be the first intake that they will be requiring SAT, ACT again for international all applicants. So it doesn't seem like there have been other takers. Cornell has decided to stay test optional, and they made that decision shortly after Dartmouth decided to go back. We haven't seen movement on any of the other Ivies yet. So we'll keep you posted, obviously, in the newsletter as well as here on the Roundup, if there seems to be more momentum gathering pace to switch back to test required. So the question of test optional, frankly, it's a dull one, and I'm frankly done with it. But it's one that deserves our attention, because internationally, for my money, it's never. Test optional should be the minimum standard for international students, because these tests are not designed for international students learning maybe British English in their schools, if at all, in their home country or a third country, not having the background to understand a lot of the language. It's going to be in the meanings and phrasings that are used in SAT and ACT tests. So they're not tests designed for international students. They're designed for U.S. citizens in U.S. high schools within the United States learning American English. So that's the real challenge for me, and always has been. I've been fortunate enough to have worked. Every institution I've been at has been test optional for international students, and it's a flag I will carry to my grave in terms of why you should not treat international students with disrespect by requiring them to take a test that was never meant for them. So hopefully that shows you where at least where I stand on that. But in terms of the elites in the United States, we're talking maybe 25, 50 schools max out of over 4,500 that are potentially going back to test required. And we're not, the schools that are also in the test required camp now, some of them are restricted because the state requires them to have state legislation requires SAT or ACT to be taken, and in some states like Florida and Georgia, I think you actually have to if you want to have any chance at scholarship. So there's two sides to this test optional coin. You might be test optional for admissions, but then if you need funding at all, you better take an SAT or ACT in some states. Even some of the elite schools will tell you that. That they'll, even though they're test optional for admissions, they will want you to take SAT or ACT if you want a chance at any funding. So it's a sticky wicket, as they say in cricket-friendly countries, but it's one that for international students it takes explaining. And frankly, being able to use that, and we certainly do at UNLV when we're talking to international students, because we're test optional, that's a big deal. It's one less test that they need to worry about. We keep things simple at an open, primarily public access institution, state institution in Nevada. We keep it simple. We're test scores for English, and then transcripts and the online app and the app fee. That's it. We don't overcomplicate the admissions process for undergraduates because we're not an elite institution. We're not the most selective school in the country. But we feel, and for international students and domestics, it's the same process. The only time that SATs or ACTs are even used are for placement tests for math mostly. So the value for most colleges and universities of SAT and ACT is it's going the way of the dodo. And if those don't know what dodo is, it's an extinct bird that I think in the early 1900s or late 1800s went kaput. So that's what we hope test required movements would also go kaput. There's a lot of people on that bandwagon, and we're certainly one of those. But that's all for that question on test optional dying at elite colleges. It may be. It's maybe a little too early to tell, certainly for 2025. Most colleges will make those decisions in the next 3 or 4 months as to whether they make any changes to their testing policy. So hopefully you're staying strong at your institutions and waving that test optional flag, particularly for your international applicants. Now the final question of the day is, what happens down under with international students? And what's happening, actually. There's a lot here that we want to cover because when it comes to being down under, they've ridden a lot of different waves over the last 10, 15 years when it comes to international students and trends. And when certain governments come in and become more restrictive, others come in and open the doors wide open because of the economic benefit, and they don't really see the consequences of how many more of these international students have. But what's happening in Australia? We talked about what's happening in Canada last week, and the news stories keep popping in on the impacts of these restrictions that are going into place in Canada. We talked about last week, that we're talking about this week with Australia. We've seen 2 or 3 trends recently with Australia. The government had their migration regulations changed that looked more closely at the bad actors in bad actor agents that were funneling students to universities that would then automatically or would leave after a semester or shorter duration and enroll in vocational programs just as to just use the universities to get their visas to get in the country, and then really didn't want to pay those university fees and switched to a lower cost vocational program instead to gain a quicker access to citizenship, permanent residency in and work in Australia. So that was one of the changes that when it came into place. There have also been some restrictions, a much stricter visa screening process that has already resulted in a 20% or denial rates of about 20% for international students applying for student visas. So the predicted impact that was going to have in the next year was about over 90,000 fewer international students coming to Australia. Australia had gotten to record territory this past year, 718,000, I think it was, at the most consistent count I've seen, over 700,000 for sure, their largest ever. But now with these regulations coming in, and why are these regulations coming in? This is what we saw last week with Canada as well, that we're seeing here with Australia this week, and likely is going to happen in the UK as well. We've seen that already with their change to their dependent ban for non-doctoral level students. Can't bring family members with them anymore as of January 1st. You've seen challenges in Australia or Canada that we talked about last week, that is going to be a cap that's going to reduce international students coming to Canada by 35% over the next 2 years, and the impact that's going to have, particularly on the vocational sector, where a lot of the bad actors existed in Canada or do exist in Canada on the public-private partnerships. And then we've seen here in Australia with this ratcheting up on study visa requirements, getting rid of some of the bad actors in terms of the agencies that are worked with that are maybe known to have students disappear or what have you. And we've seen quite a bit of that happening in Australia. There's a couple news stories that we're looking at where this record drop in the approval rate. And I think it's important to have a little context here, because when it comes to approval rates in the United States, I think at its peak it was about 80% or 86%. I think it might have been on the 80%, more on the 80% ride, 80% side globally in terms of students from all countries coming to the United States for student visas. What I've seen, obviously, that's we know in certain countries the visa approval rate is 25% or 50%. So there's a lot of the world that still has visa restrictions, not restrictions, or poor track records for those that want to come to the United States, and probably because we have the most stringent requirements, other than maybe studying in China. But then they make that path pretty easy just to get the students there. But for the U.S., we have the visa interview requirement. We have very significant funding requirements that students have to document, much more significant and much more stringent than what happens in Canada, where they, up until this past 2 months or past fall, it was all students had to show to get qualified for the funding part of their for their study permit was $10,000. The cost of the university attendance might have been $50,000, $60,000 or more, but they only needed to show $10,000. They bumped it up to $20,000, but still, that's improvement, and it's going to price out some students in the market, obviously. But students have to show that they have at least 1 year for the entire cost of education for a specific institution before they get their visa, before they get their I-20 to get their visa. So there is a lot happening down under that on the student front, the visa front. That's in terms of how they are being viewed, depending on who their agency is, what institutions they're going to. All of those are being much more highly scrutinized. But there's also in Canada, there's also in the Australian situation, and in the UK, you've seen the challenges that have existed because there's been these huge increases in international students. The UK got up to 700,000, I think. Australia is over 700,000. Canada got over 800,000 this past year, so maybe closer to 900,000. What has the news been like in those countries when it comes to international students? There's no housing. We've got students on food stamps, so that they're putting all their money into housing. They don't have any money for food. That in Canada, in Australia, in the UK, those are very common stories that happened. And the reason why they're coming is because those countries have become so dependent on the revenue from these students that they've pushed the boat out too far with bringing more and more in, and the resulting effect on the communities where they live. And that's one thing that most universities outside the United States don't have residence halls on campus. And those that do, it's very premium space. Yeah, in most of these countries, they're relying on the local housing stock to absorb their students. Whereas on our campuses in the U.S., we have housing for almost all undergraduates and even some grad student housing on certain campuses. So what we've seen is that there's real challenges in some of these countries that have pushed the boat out very far. And I've made this case from day one when we started SMIE Consulting. The United States is the best destination when it comes to quality. It's the best destination in terms of capacity to enroll more international students. We're at 5% of our total higher ed population being international now. In Canada, it's pushing 35. In Australia, it's 40%. In the UK, it's 35%. So that's the result of becoming so dependent on those international students to fund their institutions. So that without regard for the impact on the local communities that really are absorbing those students in terms of the housing, in terms of dietary needs, in terms of religious needs, in terms of all these other social things that they need to have in their communities. That in the U.S. we provide those on most cases on our campuses. That doesn't happen at most of the rest of the world. So these students are kind of being left to their own devices, and that don't have proper guidance all the way around, and they get themselves in situations that they shouldn't be in. So what's happening down under with international students is there's going to be a clampdown. There already is. The visa rates are dropping. There's going to be 90,000 fewer international students going to Australia this year as a result. So a lot to digest with what's happening in all the different major receiving countries. And that's what we keep you up to date with here on the Roundup and in the newsletter. So please, if you aren't already, like and subscribe and share this out to your colleagues who might need to see this. Also, please feel free to share the links to our newsletter as well so that they can have that for their edification. So thanks very much again for being a part of the conversation today. And for those of you in love, happy Valentine's Day. Enjoy it. Take care.